And now we move to the last paper of the
Could I have the clicker?
of the day. Yeah. Peter Hoffman from the ECB is going to be the presenter.
Thanks, Anatoly, and thanks to the organizers for a great conference and for putting the paper on the program. So this is joint work with my colleagues Tony Arnart, Agnese Leonello, and Davide Porcellacchia. Since we all work at the ECB, there's also a disclaimer, which is the usual one, plus there's a little add-on that also emphasizes that the ECB is running an official digital euro project, and we're not part of that project. We all work in the research department. Okay, so motivation, I can keep it very short. Maybe some of you also looked into the various newspapers yesterday. So yesterday there was a flurry of op-eds on the case for the digital euro, but more broadly, I guess many of you will be aware that there's this active thinking by many central banks around the world about toying with the idea of implementing central bank digital currency. So the BIS regularly surveys these efforts, and there's about 90% of the respondent central banks, they do some form of research at least. Many go much further, so there's some that have a pilot. There's very few CBDCs that are active or live. So there's one in the Bahamas, one in Nigeria, I think another one in the Eastern Caribbean, but there's many others in the pipeline, and that pipeline is growing fast. So it's likely to become a reality in a substantial number of economies sooner or later. And so, of course, the widespread adoption of CBDC, in particular, actually, a retail CBDC would certainly entail major changes to the financial system. And so, before going there, then it's just rational behavior dictates that we should work on understanding where are we actually going and what does it mean for the financial system, right? So, as the title already says, the paper asks a relatively straightforward question, which is what's the effect of CBDC on financial stability? Policymakers have actually been thinking quite publicly about this, so there's also some publication by, I think, 7 central banks, which was coordinated by the BIS, and so there's a report that voices these concerns that CBDC could be an ultimate store of value, and that could amplify the risk of bank runs, right? When depositors are concerned with the stability of banks, that's the optimal place to run to would be the central bank, right? So we have a model that speaks to that. And then also we go a little further, we try to go a little further, and we try to think about are there particular CBDC design features that can possibly mitigate some of these concerns. And I've actually already talked to several people here that have been asking me, so there's one particular proposal which is sort of to establish holding limits on CBDC, so I'll try to speak to this at the end as well. There's some other proposals that go in a similar but not quite the same direction. We try to think a bit about that, depending on time. Okay, so what we do in the paper, so we incorporate CBDC in an otherwise rather parsimonious model of bank runs. I don't want to say standard because, so it's a global games model, so it has a few features that are quite attractive for us because it allows us to connect the default probability of banks, or the risk of bank runs, to the deposit contract that is offered by the bank, which is a monopolist in the model, and of course CBDC, which affects both of these elements in equilibrium. And so the headline result of the paper is that the relationship between remuneration on CBDC and bank fragility, or the probability of a bank run, is U-shaped. So in other words, so that the overall effect is ambiguous and could go in either way, and that overall effect is basically the combination of two forces that pull or push, however you want, in opposing directions. So there's the direct effect, and that is pretty much in line with, I would say, the narrative that's been out there, that if we hold the deposit contract fixed and we just offer a more attractive remuneration for those that want to run on a bank, well, that would increase the risk of bank runs, right? If you have a more attractive outside option, well, you will eventually go for that, holding everything else fixed, right? But so the bank is not an innocent bystander in the model. The bank actually will react, and that gives rise to an indirect effect that goes in the opposite direction, right? So basically, given that consumers have the option to run into CBDC, which is a more attractive outside option, well, the bank will take that into account because the bank only makes profits when it is not insolvent, right? So the bank will react to this improvement in the outside option by offering a more attractive deposit contract, and that more attractive deposit contract, at least on the margin, will keep investors with the bank, and that will lead to a reduction in bank fragility, right? So we have these two forces that pull in opposite directions, and then literally what happens in equilibrium is, well, one effect will be stronger than the other. That depends on parameters. Okay. Then, as said, we try to explore different CBDC design proposals. We look at the holding limits that I mentioned, and we show that they have an ambiguous impact, and that is very much in line with the headline result, because basically what holding limits do in our context is that they change the effective remuneration of depositors outside option. And so that means holding limits, the effect of holding limits can also go in either way. Right? So they're not a silver bullet very much. And then we also look at something that we label contingent remuneration. There have also been some loose proposals out there, and we show that under some conditions they can improve financial stability. And then last but not least, I won't be able to talk about it, but let me mention here, we also do some extensions of the model, so sort of the, I would say, usual suspects in that literature you can look at. One is imperfect competition. Since we have a monopolist bank, we also look at imperfect competition in deposit markets, and we look at risk-taking on the asset side of the bank balance sheet, and sort of our results also hold up in that context. Okay, so let me not say much about the literature, except I'm very grateful to have a global games expert like Xavier as a discussant. And so we speak, of course, to the literature on CBDC, and then more broadly to things people have been doing in global games. So let me jump to the model. There's a typo on the first line, so there's 3 dates, but they're not labeled 1, 2, 3, but 0, 1, 2, as you will see slightly below. And the setup to begin with is fairly standard. So there's a single good, it's perfectly divisible. There's 3 dates, there's no discounting. Everybody's risk neutral. There's a monopolist bank that is profit maximizing. And then there's a continuum of investors. They have 1 unit of funds each. And then at the beginning of the game, the bank tries to raise funds from depositors and offers them a demand deposit contract with interest rates R1 and R2. So R1 is what depositors get when they withdraw funds at t equals 1, and R2 is what they get if they stick to the end, t equals 2, when the risky project that the bank invests this fund in materializes. And so this project returns R times theta at maturity, and there is a cost of premature liquidation, which is a payoff of L that is less than 1, right? So early liquidation comes with losses. That is, of course, where much of the interaction, strategic interaction happens. So this payoff is a composite of 2 variables. R, which is greater than 2, is just the return on lending. But more crucially, especially for this type of model, is there's theta, which is a random variable, and that represents what's called the fundamentals of the economy, right? So the larger theta is, the more profitable is the project, or the opposite. Okay. And so then we get to, that's the bank, so then we get to depositors. So at the beginning of the game, they decide whether they want to put their money into the bank or they want to keep it outside the bank. So as said, the bank offers this deposit contract, for which we'll have to solve, of course, or alternatively, keeping money outside the bank, depositors, investors, they can keep their savings in CBDC or cash, right? And so we assume that CBDC pays a remuneration of a gross return of omega per period, right? So omega denotes the CBDC remuneration, and cash pays 1. So as soon as omega is strictly greater than 1, basically CBDC strictly dominates cash, and there will only be CBDC in the economy, while in the limit, if omega is equal to 1, people are indifferent, and then CBDC doesn't have any other function, right? So the only thing that CBDC does is it offers a more attractive, safe remuneration, right? So think of it if you want, as remunerated cash, which digitally we can, of course, do nowadays. Okay, and then at the interim stage, at t=1, investors can decide to withdraw their funds or not, right? And as is typical in these global games type of models, they all get a noisy private signal that is equal to this economic fundamental theta plus an individual noise term, and that if investors decide to withdraw prematurely, then the bank has to liquidate part of the investment project in order to pay out those withdrawing investors, right? And there's some technical stuff here, so to make things simple, we assume that noise is vanishing, and also we assume that when the bank cannot serve, either because of liquidity or an insolvency, there's full bankruptcy costs, so everything, all output is lost. Okay, and then we solve for the equilibrium of the model in 3 separate steps. So in the first step, we take the deposit contract as given, and we solve for the endogenous probability of a bank run, theta star, which of course is a function of the CBDC remuneration omega, as well as the deposit contract offered by the bank. Then in the second step, taking into account this endogenously determined probability of a bank run, we solve for the bank's optimal deposit contract, which again, of course, is a function of CBDC remuneration, because in the end, CBDC is the competition that the bank faces, right? So if I offer very poor terms, then investors will not fund the bank. And then finally, we put these 2 pieces together, and so then we can express the equilibrium probability of a bank run as a function of omega CBDC remuneration directly, but also the equilibrium contract, which again in turn depends on the remuneration of CBDC. And then to gauge the overall effect of CBDC remuneration on this, well, so we need to disentangle this direct and indirect effect, right? So we have that it depends both directly and through the contract on omega, the CBDC remuneration. Okay. So since I'm assuming that not everybody is familiar with this global games methodology, I'm going to skip a bunch of details, but just to say a few things. So typically you solve this by establishing sort of a failure threshold of this fundamental, which basically means that the unique equilibrium is characterized by everybody running on the bank if the realization of this economic fundamental falls below a certain threshold, right? So if the public signal or the private signal that is given to individuals is very low, they will run. If it's very high, not really. And then to solve for this threshold, we basically establish indifference of depositors between sticking to the bank. That is the left hand of, that's the right hand of this. So sticking to the bank means you earn R2, which is conditional on the bank being solvent at t=2, or withdrawing prematurely, in which case investors get R1, again conditional on the bank being liquid at that time. It will never be insolvent, but it may be liquid. And then the proceeds that investors get is R1, they would stick it into a CBDC account for an additional period. That's why you have this term omega in the integral on the left-hand side, and that immediately tells you already that if I increase CBDC remuneration, I increase the benefits from withdrawing at t=1, right? And so then, thank you, one can solve this, and then we can solve for this failure threshold, and we can do it in closed form, which I put it here, and basically then you can work out quite easily, since L is less than 1, and R1 must be, well, it will be 1 in equilibrium, it can never be less than 1, that the direct effect is positive, right? So basically, offering investors a more attractive outside options increases their propensity to withdraw funds prematurely because they have access to suddenly they have access to more attractive storage technology, and that is very bad for bank fragility. Okay, given this, we can then solve the bank's maximization problem. So the bank basically makes profits that are equal to the payoff of the risky project minus the cost of deposit funding, conditional, that's what you have in the integral, conditional on the bank surviving, right? So conditional that the realization of theta is higher than theta star. That is the profit, subject to depositors' or investors' participation constraints. So the bank, of course, needs to offer a deposit contract that makes sure that depositors will actually put their money into the bank so that the bank can invest into the project. And so that you have on the right-hand side, which is basically the expected payoff. So it's kind of like the probability of the bank's survival times R2. That must be greater than omega square, which is basically investors' ex ante outside option at time zero when they decide to put money in the bank or not. That is omega square, right? We have the per period remuneration omega, right? And then we can impose some parametric conditions in order to ensure that the solution to the bank's maximization problem comes from the depositor's participation constraint, which is what the proposition below says. And then you can immediately see, so suppose that weak inequality is actually an equality, then you can immediately see if I increase CBDC remuneration, the right-hand side goes up, so then the left-hand side must go up as well, so the bank must offer a more attractive contract if the outside option becomes more valuable or more attractive and the participation constraint is binding, right? So then we can put all of these things together. We have the direct effect and the indirect effect. I can ignore R1 here because it's equal to 1 as the previous proposition has shown. So then we have that the direct effect is positive. Again, a more attractive outside option induces more withdrawals. That increases fragility. But then we have this countervailing effect that the bank takes this into account. As a result, it will offer a more attractive deposit contract, and that works in the opposite direction. Then we can work out some sufficient conditions, but let me skip over it in the interest of time. So putting these things together, here's a numerical example, and then we will typically have a U-shape, right? That basically the effect of increasing CBDC remuneration on bank fragility, which is sort of a measure of financial stability here, that it's U-shaped and can have a different sign depending on where we stand in terms of the level. And also actually tells us that there could be a social optimum, right? So in this model, actually maximizing social welfare is equal to minimizing financial fragility, so you can even have an optimal level of CBDC remuneration. I have about 2 minutes, is that right? 1, okay, good. So then we look at these 2 design proposals that I mentioned, and maybe just let me, in the interest of time, just talk about the holding limits. So holding limits, one way to think about it is basically that we have a limit of what is the proportion of their wealth, or we can also do it in nominal terms, since depositors have exactly 1 unit, it doesn't even matter. So suppose we just restrict that, and whenever depositors withdraw, they can only keep a fraction of their wealth in CBDC, and they must hold the remainder in cash. And so what that effectively does in the model, it reduces the remuneration that they receive on their outside option. And that means, we move either to the left or to the right on this picture, and basically means there's some region, which is when CBDC remuneration is above the optimal level, then, it will be actually a good idea to reduce this effective remuneration of the outside option, and that can raise financial stability. However, if we're below already, if we're already to the left side of the optimum, to the local minimum there, on the global minimum, then that would be counterproductive, right? So that means that, holding limits in line with the headline result, they can have an ambiguous effect on financial stability, and that directly works to their effect on the overall remuneration, right? So let me stop here. So we try to, take things seriously in putting CBDC remuneration in an otherwise rather parsimonious model of bank runs with global games. And we model CBDC as an improvement in investors' outside options. So there's also, of course, other interpretations, but it's kind of a straightforward one. And we find this U-shaped relationship between CBDC remuneration on bank fragility based on these two countervailing forces that I've talked about. And then we try to talk a bit about design, which I had to keep short in the interest of time. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Peter. So now it's time for our last discussant of the day, who is, there is no need to introduce him. Xavier Vives.
Yes, thank you very much. I have prepared a light discussion in the anticipation that we would be tired at the end of the day, and the absorption capacity is limited after so many good papers. So, in a nutshell, the paper is very interesting. I recommend to read it. It's quite, I think, elegant in the modeling and easy to understand the drivers, and I think many more things can be done. Just quickly, let me tell you a little bit, a quick review, and then some comments. So, we know that central banks are exploring the cost and benefits of central bank digital currency. There is this potential concern on adverse effects on financial stability, as well as credit provision, although this is not the object of this paper. The concern on that the CBDC may increase runs, it could be even worse if the CBDC is remunerated, right? Because then there is an extra incentive, maybe to be there, at least face value, So the paper presents this model, kind of a global games model of bank runs with a monopoly bank and a remunerated CBDC. So, as it has been well explained, so I'll go very quickly, an increase in CBDC remuneration has two effects in the model. It makes interim withdrawals more attractive by increasing the payoff from storing funds in the CBDC for future consumption. This is a direct effect. That's the first intuition. It makes the bank more fragile, consistent with the general concern, if you want. The second, it induces the bank to offer more attractive deposit rates because consumers would otherwise not provide any funding. As a result, consumers or depositors have lower incentives to withdraw their funds, and this is the indirect effect. The total effect then depends obviously on the relative strengths of the two countervailing forces and under some parameter conditions, so maintain assumptions in principle the bank investment opportunity is sufficiently profitable and the CBDC remuneration is not too large. We have this U-shaped relationship between bank fragility and CBDC remuneration that has been shown. Okay? Bank fragility is minimized and welfare in the economy maximized for a strictly positive level of CBDC remuneration. Okay, but now let's introduce, in fact, an extension that Peter has not had time to introduce. We have, if we introduce competition, then the situation may change, and this is what I think is a robustness check they do. The U-shaped form on the top is the monopoly, okay? But then, as we increase competition, in this case, the bargaining power of the depositor, okay, model it this way, it keeps going down until, if you want, with perfect competition, you have just that increasing CBDC remuneration, you increase the theta star, which is the critical threshold below which there is a run, and so, or the bank fails. And therefore would be counterproductive. And so the general message here is a decline in the bank bargaining power dampens the impact of CBDC remuneration on deposit rates. What happens is when the bank is a monopoly, it pays very low rates. Okay, and then the competition introduced by the CBDC counteracts that. Okay, so that's that. Okay, second set of results, quickly, on CBDC design. When a central bank faces no restrictions on setting the CBDC rate, then holding limits do not lead to additional benefits, okay? Because the central bank can achieve already the best outcome by setting the CBDC remuneration, as we have seen. Otherwise, holding limits may help in implementing the optimal outcome, as it has been mentioned. And then in terms of contingent remuneration, that's to say that depending on how many withdrawals do you have in the first period, you may change the remuneration to the CBDC in the second period, may help. Okay, so this lower reduced remuneration during the financial turmoil, that's to say if there have been too many, if you want, withdrawals, can lower bank fragility. Okay, so that's a possibility result. Then another result, which he has not had time to explain, is that with risk-taking on the asset side, that's to say the bank monitors loans, let's say, and then but can't take risk on the asset side, and this is important, a fixed deposit contract, okay, increasing CBDC remuneration increases monitoring by the banker and may increase stability, okay, and I will comment on this in a moment. So, the evaluation is already said, it's a very interesting paper. President Lagarde said that in Sintra that a decision on CBDC, a first decision will be taken in October, at least for an experimental phase. So it's getting some traction, as you know. Also, the financial commissioner in the European Union also is talking about that and is moving. So it's a tractable theoretical contribution with a plausible narrative, and it's the main result is quite nice. Now, one first comment is the last bullet point. It would be nice to have a calibration of the model with some realistic parameters to see what rates you have to promise to avoid a run depending on CBDC remuneration. Because my first impression is that you have to promise a lot to avoid a run. Okay, and so maybe your effect is true, but then in practice, what does it mean in practice? So that's one for big picture now, and this I think it's an important slide. So, and this is more general, so outside of your model, okay, but I think it's important to put it on the table. What market failure is CBDC addressing? So according to the House of Lords and Mervyn King, for example, is it a solution in search of a problem? So this was the conclusion of the report in the House of Lords. I mean, most people say that the CBDC is mostly a defensive response to a new private forms of digital payments that may become kind of a monopoly. This was triggered by Facebook, Libra, etc. And then the main question is, if the benefit of CBDC is to increase competition in payment systems, or to avoid potential monopoly positions in digital payments, or maybe facilitate cross-border payments, then the question is, can the goal be achieved with other means, for example, regulation and competition policy more effectively? This is a little bit the position we took in the report we wrote. Every year we write a report with ESN CPR on the banking initiative. Basically, we urge caution in its development, and we so clearly support to improve what we could term wholesale CBDC, okay, so the rail channels, okay, but we would urge more caution for the retail CBDC. And then, but going back to the paper, what is the market failure that CBDC is addressing in your paper? Because you have CBDC, fine. And you know why I know why you have it, right? But if we look from a theoretical perspective, what is the market failure that it is addressing? Okay, yes. So in a sense, the benchmark of comparison, if we are worried about potential monopoly positions in digital payments, you should have a model with a potential monopoly position in digital payments, then introduce in fact, well, you are aware of that, I think. I'm just repeating something maybe obvious. A second point is that, as we have been discussing recently, we have we see that with digital technology, social media, concentration of deposits, deposits fly very quickly. CBDC may make this go faster. Then, and connecting to the model. Here then, particularly, maybe the vanishing noise assumption, which is a standard, is not so good, right? Because if we think of people getting these signals from social media and withdrawing, probably this will is not a vanishing noise case. Then, if we look with more substantial noise, you reintroduce multiple equilibria. But this is fine. I think this can be tackled, because basically then the structure, we know how to deal with this, we know how to deal with the equilibrium set, comparative statics in the equilibrium set, and basically the extremal equilibria have the properties that you want. And then comment on the asset side result. This result, I am pretty sure that it cannot be robust, because once you endogenize the deposit contract, which makes sense, obviously, then I think the following will happen. CBDC will induce an increase in deposit rates. This will reduce the margins of the banks, and this will decrease typically monitoring, because the banks have less on a stake on that, if you want. And then, as many people have shown, and David and Rafael in particular, this will increase risk taking. Okay. I have some other considerations, which I will do very briefly before I am being completely stopped, which I think are things that you know. So, liability structure. Okay, so the analysis abstract from changes in the type of funding of banks. Maybe if we introduce CBDC, and you raise the cost of deposits, maybe they will go more for wholesale funding, which is very unstable. Okay, so that's another impact on the potential in the liability structure. There are general equilibrium effects which are known from the literature, which I will skip in the interest of time. But I would like to say something on the moral hazard issue, because this may be an interesting connection. Typically, we think that bankers and bank managers have a moral hazard problem, which may be insufficient effort or maybe too much risk taking. Here, if we think in terms of an incentive efficient solution that you have to intervene when the moral hazard problem of the banker is too high, okay, and the way to intervene is basically, since the banker wants to continue, is some form of restructuring, etc., then one potential trigger of that is precisely a run. So not all runs are inefficient, right? And this is what with my paper with Jean-Charles also we showed. And here, since CBDC may change this potential intervention point, it could be an extra tool, in a sense, to implement an incentive-efficient allocation. Okay, so that's well, this is it, but let me not do it. Final comment. I have to end. But I
Please go on.
It's a technical comment, but I think it's...
we risk a mutiny by the audience, but...
No, they want to hear this technical comment. The technical comment is that as in most of, or at least in some of these global games, we assume an upper dominant region, so if you don't know what it is, forget about it, but it's not a good assumption. So it's not... it's a convenient assumption, but it's not a good one. But now let me point out there is a new paper by Anil K. Shap and Goffers, which is forthcoming in JPE, that they do having a similar global games model, but they can do without. So that's to say, they provide a good rationale for the upper dominant region in a model where the banks also do some monitoring. Okay, so just to look at it, because it's maybe a way also to improve the paper. I stop.
Thank you very much, Xavier. This was more of a lecture rather than a discussion, but thank you very much.
Sorry.
And Peter?
All right, let me be brief, except thank you. So that's super useful. So I think there's a few points we had already been discussing, but we know we still have things to do. So let me just choose a few points. What's the inefficiency? So I think inefficiency is the bank actually chooses to be too fragile in equilibrium, right? Because the bank doesn't internalize anything what happens to depositors' funds. And so that actually, sort of competition through CBDC can help there by adding some discipline, basically, to make the bank be less fragile in equilibrium. The efficient runs is definitely something I remember talking to my co-authors. So I think they mentioned that. So I think maybe that's some direction we want to push in further, right? Because you give us basically a lot of different alleys we can go to, and I think we need to choose. I'm not sure I'll speak much to why CBDC. So that's kind of the beauty of the paper, that we don't have to deal with that question, which is of course maybe the bigger question. So I think this paper is more like if central banks go that way, these other things to be taken into account. Then you mentioned something about SVB and the ease of withdrawals. So that, if you want, is actually a possibly different interpretation of the model, right? So it's a real model in the end, but so of course you could in principle also think maybe Omega is not a CBDC, but it's sort of a convenience or a lack of disutility, right? So you could think of like when you actually withdraw cash, you have some inconvenience cost associated with that, and sort of Omega would be the benefit you derive from not incurring that inconvenience. So I think it speaks to that as well, and yeah, pretty much that. I think I'll stop here, and maybe we have a question or two, since we're kind of out of time.
Questions from the floor? Veronica?
Description of CBDC, I was all the time thinking of money market funds. And I don't see any fundamental difference in the way that is modeled with money market funds, and the source of instability is very much what has been discussed this morning, bad interest rate, risk management, and too much of uninsured deposits, which are the ones that fly very fast. So maybe related to what Xavier was referring, is this in where we should think of CBDC as a disruptive force? Is it in the speed at which that happens? Is it a force for introducing competition in payment technologies for retail? What is the main thing that is captured in these currencies?
Maybe one second to follow up on that one. So especially given that now the money market fund have access to the reverse repo facility, which would be basically giving direct access to retail to the central bank anyway. So it seems to be like a relative statement, given that we already have that, especially in the US, like in Europe, it's another story. But.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on a remark made by Xavier when we mentioned that he didn't believe that the result would be robust when you include asset side considerations. But actually, my problem is still, takes place earlier. Other than based on your recent remark that remuneration of the alternative option would incentivize efficiency, I do not see that how the indirect effect can lead to an interior solution and still to the extreme solution. So if is correct what I have interpreted, what would be how do you model here the efficiency gains from internal efficiency gains from CBDC remuneration?
Peter, you can answer.
Okay, so let me connect, since Conta jumped at the end on Veronica's point. So I think it's not the first time we hear this comment, and I kind of agree. So pretty much what we have is a remunerated outside option. And in principle, you can also think of, this could be financial markets, a money market fund. And so I think in principle that's true, and it's a possible interpretation. There's, of course, a few things that are outside the model that wouldn't very much matter for the debate on CBDC. So money market funds, they're not a medium of exchange, right, nowadays. you could think of technology getting us somewhere, so that maybe if I go into a shop, I don't pay with money, like fiat, maybe I pay with money market fund shares, right? So if we go somewhere there, which I guess technologically that's not so difficult anymore, not necessarily very difficult, not that I know much about that, but sounds plausible to me, that would be a different interpretation of exactly the same thing. What matters here is the bank faces some sort of more fierce competition, right? In the standard model, there's just cash, which is a very nice competitor from the perspective of the bank, right? And it's the reason why deposits are remunerated so low. But of course, it doesn't have to be CBDC in that sense. It could be anything that is a more attractive outside option and that provides payment offers. It could also be content stable coins in that sense as well, as long as they're stable, of course, right? I'm not sure I've exactly understood your remark on the risk taking. Basically, the way it would be modeled is, the bank monitors, and then the bank can decide how much effort to put in monitoring, and of course, the outside option of depositors affects these incentives as well. So if we want to say anything sort of semi-analytically, we make quite a lot of effort, but of course we can't do so without, and also at the same time endogenize the deposit contract, because then you have like an increasing number of cross terms. So basically the way we went right now is sort of, I think, what we can do, and I think there we have something that still, to us, it makes sense. But I'm not sure I fully understood your question, I must be fair. We can maybe take it up after.
Okay, so thank you very much again, Peter and Xavier, for these last contributions of the day.